Welcome to Age of AI, Politics, Law, and Society, hosted by Medlir, Chris Lamont, and Young Diogenes, in association with the Global Governance Institute in Brussels.
Hello and welcome to our Age of AI podcast. I'm Chris Lamont, here with Medlir. Today's episode is the first episode of our 9th season and coincides with the United Nations' Summit of the Future, which Medlir will be attending and we will discuss here. Today, we have a lot of ground to cover. First, we'll revisit AI agents, AI and US-China relations, and also China's recent moves in regulating AI. Then we'll wrap up with a discussion of the Summit of the Future and AI and development. Of course, one of the topics we keep coming back to is AI's potential impact on productivity. In fact, we've seen it again in Mario Draghi's recent report on European Union competitiveness, where Draghi highlights a growing productivity gap between the European Union and the US that is attributed largely to the tech sector. Now, of course, one of the solutions or one of the tools that's seen as a way to jumpstart productivity is a tool that helps us automate complex tasks, and that is agentic AI. Medlir, can you tell us a little bit more about agentic AI?
It seems that I think this seems to be the next exciting kind of development when it comes to especially generative AI and large language models. The difference between what we've been having until now, especially with ChatGPT and others, is the incorporation of, and I'm quoting here from some material as well, of chaining capability. What that means is that it can take a sequence of actions in response to a single request, breaks it down to complex tasks into smaller, manageable tasks. So, for example, when asked to create a website, an agentic AI system would autonomously generate a series of goals, and then you'd able to accomplish those objectives. So this is, we're professors, obviously, and researchers, but this is like having your own personal research assistant or a teaching assistant. And to be honest with you, I think for most people, this is going to be probably the most useful aspect of AI on a daily basis, right? Moving into smaller, more bespoke use of AI rather than generic and general use of it. This may also address, in my mind at least, one of the kind of outstanding concerns with regards to this new applications of AI, and that is, how do you monetize it, right? How do you make sure that you make money out of it? There's been a lot of concern. A lot of hand-wringing about this is that there's been a lot of investment, right? Capital investment when it comes to, I think, when it comes to these technologies, but very little revenue, right? And so this may address in part some of that concern.
That's an interesting point because we tend not to think about it. But when you think about your traditional internet search, where you enter a term or a few terms and you get a list of search results, search engines can monetize that by offering people or customers a preferential kind of place high up in the search results. And also people try to game it. You have the entire industry of search optimization experts who would flag certain keywords that you can use to increase your standing in these search results. But as people are saying, there's no reason to do a traditional search anymore when you can just ask a tool like ChatGPT a question, right? And some browsers are integrating kind of generative AI into the browsers themselves. You don't have a list anymore. Right? You just have a paragraph of text. And how do you monetize that?
That's one aspect of it. But the monetization of that particular task that you just pointed out is one problem. Another very, I think even more challenging, more problematic, at least from a user perspective, is that once you're only given those kinds of offers, right, where it's an AI curated kind of content, number one, you're assuming that actually is factual information. And number two, the algorithmic biases may be hidden. And so you're concerned about what kind of information is coming to the top. And third, you're not able to be an agent for yourself, right? And this is where this agentic AI in a way is helpful. But you're not able to scroll and say, look, I want to know everything there is. I want to see all the different sources. And then I want to be the one making the selection of those because I know which of these kind of sources is the most reliable one. And that kind of selection, if it's AI, whether it's a Gemini or others that are built into these search engines now, personally, I don't like using them that way. I don't trust it. And we've had this conversation before in terms of reliability. I don't think we are there yet. And part of it is because of the way that also ChatGPT and other LLMs produce information, right? They're not actually recalling information. They're only predicting words on the basis of association with each other, which word follows the next one or follows the previous one on base of probability kind of calculations. And so you're not always going to get correct information. And this gets to those topics of discussions like falsifications or fabrications or concoctions or whatever, hallucinations, whatever terms you want to use when it comes to that. So that's a concern, again, when it comes with regards to that particular use, so to speak, of ChatGPT.
And that brings us back to productivity, where we might end up in a place where you have the illusion of increased productivity and the illusion of more,
Right.
but the quality of what is more is actually not even that. I was going to say not that great, but it could be even more insidious than that. Right? It could be exploited against you. And you're losing the digital literacy skills and tools that kind of you would have had in the past, where you would know what websites are providing information that you have a high degree of confidence in, and which websites you're more skeptical about when it's all kind of just bundled into a paragraph. Even if references are provided, if the point is a shortcut, you might not be looking too closely at where the information is coming from.
I think, Chris, there's also like one other thing. Think about yourself. How many times your research interests have been by the fact that you saw an article, but then another article next to it, and then you go from there and you're just going to follow a particular trail. You go down the rabbit hole, perhaps, and then you find a very interesting discussion and debate that was not your main objective, but this becomes actually even more interesting for you. That's something that gets lost as well in these types of research results that will be optimized by ChatGPT. There's one last thing that maybe before we move on to the next topic that I think is important to talk about here, and that is I'm really excited, first of all, about agentic AI. For the first time, I see something that I can actually use and can be helpful to me as an individual, but as a professor or as a researcher. So I am optimistic and I feel good about this. However, again, because we ended, I think, the last season with a cautionary note about this hype and over-optimism for every new shiny product that comes our way. And so we have to hold back our enthusiasm. We have to test. We have to be careful with the way we use this, implement this. Again, we have to see the viability of these kinds of products that come our way. But again, so far, so good. I enjoy this I think this is the right direction when it comes to LLMs. There's other, obviously, forms of AI that we're not talking about today, but that may be useful in other contexts. But when it comes to this, I think it's a good step in the right direction, I think.
Absolutely. And as you said earlier, when it comes to tasks like designing or building a website, it used to be that if you did not have a particular skill set of being able to enter in kind of code, then you would have to find somebody else to do this or get an assistant to do this for you. But now with agentic AI, you can just say broadly what you want.
Right.
Do you want a drop down tab? Do you want it to look like this? Right? You can just give it instructions, much like you would a assistant, and it will be able to sequentially do all those complex tasks that you are
as
asking.
long as we remember, again, the problem of algorithmic bias, setup bias, the problem of data, right? Data collection, the problem of data privacy, right? And I think we'll talk about this a little bit later with regards to protection of data, like whether it's artists or academics or whoever. And more importantly, as long as we remember, and I think this should be obligatory, anytime any employee or any student or anyone is encouraged to use AI, they must take, I think, or they must have a certificate in critical thinking. All right? Because what you get out of AI, it very much depends on the quality of the input in terms of the kind of prompts and questions, and then also your ability to critically appraise what is being served to you. And so if you have that critical skill, then AI is going to be useful. But one of the, I think, most detrimental aspects of AI, I think, in today's society is that it's going to make us complicit and compliant. And if we're not very proactive about developing critical thinking skills, then I think, unfortunately, we're not going to benefit much from it. We're going to end up with some level of idiocracy of the movie where we don't know how to do very basic tasks because we trust certain products without really thinking through that particular problem properly, how we arrived there. Let's move on, Chris, to Another
Right. So
development.
this is one kind of aspect: competitiveness, productivity, agentic AI that we wanted to look at today. The next gets back to something that we have explored quite a bit in some previous episodes, and that's AI, critical technologies, and great power competition. And we've seen a lot of focus on the United Nations, but also at different international organizations and regional organizations on the question of both standard setting, but also how to harness AI for broader goals like this, to achieve broader goals like the Sustainable Development Goals.
And actually, the first news is actually good news. I've been following this for some time because I remember there's been back and forth. I think, Chris, you were with me when we were in Brussels last, and we had some conversation with EU officials, and they pointed out the fact that the Americans and the Chinese were working at cross purposes with each other. And so we went back to that a little bit, and we found out actually the story is a bit more complicated than that. In fact, when you
because the Chinese did support the U.S. resolution, correct?
Exactly, right? Our conversation was back in May, I think, and yet we found out as we dug up a little bit deeper on this issue that in fact the Chinese had supported a previous U.S. resolution at the United Nations General Assembly, and then in exchange the Americans had promised the Chinese to pass their version of the resolution, which happened in June. What are these two resolutions? The first one was, I think, in March of this year, 2024, where the U.S.-sponsored UN resolution, basically it was titled Seizing the Opportunity of Safe, Secure, and Trustworthy Artificial Intelligence Systems for Sustainable Development. It's important here to point out there's a lot of aspirational language there, but most of the, and this was supported, by the way, before it was approved and by the overwhelmingly, I think 130 countries approved the resolution. But before it was done so, there were about 50 countries that supported right away from across the world, and many of them from the global south. But the essence really of the resolution is about making sure that any kind of global framework for regulating it is one that respects, in a way, domestic sovereignty a little bit, right? And also it's not too hard on the big tech companies or even on governments themselves. So the United States very much interested in keeping the space a little bit freer, a little bit open than let's say others may want in this particular case. But there was a hint here to what the Chinese would do later with an eye towards sustainable development and with an eye towards the global south. So that was the American side of the story. Fast forward in June, the Chinese sponsored another resolution, which was supported by the United States. And again, by the majority, by the overwhelming majority. I think there were 123 countries that co-sponsored it. And this was approved in June, where basically it urged wealthy developed nations. So this was like part 2 of that same resolution the United States approved or sponsored in March, urging wealthy developed nations to close the widening gap with developing countries and ensure that they have equal opportunities to use and benefit from artificial intelligence. So this shifts the discussion to a very different space. I think it's a very interesting space, one that we at the Global Governance Institute have been working on for some time. This issue of AI for social benefits, right? AI for good, AI for global south. Your thoughts on this, Chris?
And in a previous episode from the past season, right, you discussed AI for peace, right? And the different kind of ways that AI tools can contribute to a wide set of goals that largely could resolve and address problems that we are having difficulty addressing in the absence of them. And I think here, not just in the scope of AI for good, but more broadly speaking, AI, particularly generative AI, brings with it a lot of common regulatory challenges that countries at some point in time are going to have to face, and many are already facing today and have faced in the past as a result of some of these disruptions. And one of those challenges relates to rights, right? Of course, recently in the news, you had a music streamer, I believe in the state of North Carolina, who was charged with fraudulently producing and manipulating Spotify through bots to stream AI-generated music content and divert large amounts of royalties, allegedly, to himself. But beyond that, if you think about rights and royalties, one thing that has come up in the US, but also in China, is the right to your own voice in the context of both kind of the training and use of artificial generative intelligence. Now, of course, there was a kind of that issue earlier with OpenAI and ChatGPT and their solicitation of Scarlett Johansson's voice, and then using a voice that sounded very similar to the voice, and then eventually withdrawing this. In China, there was a similar case recently where a voice actor sued a few companies for AI replicated voice infringement. And in the case of China's courts, the courts found that the companies had infringed on the plaintiff's rights and ordered payment of damages. I believe Nikkei Asia had a story on this where it was like $35,000 in damages were ordered to be paid by these companies to this voice actor. But it's not just this one case in China that's interesting. And that's kind of what the story goes into, is that if you look at what the Chinese courts have been doing, there have been a number of cases producing judgments and answering some of these questions that are posed in relation to rights and artificial generative intelligence. And kind of by going out there quickly, will Chinese courts be setting kind of some of the groundwork for eventual international standards on this? And of course, I myself am currently in Japan. It's noted that in the context of Japan, right, Japan has been relatively slow. These discussions about rules and the debates over AI generated voices are just beginning. Whereas in China, you already have court cases that have explored a wide variety of generative AI case uses, such as the use of artificial generative intelligence in the context of them to generate, and
which
also,
is a big business,
right? Which is
it is a huge
yes, exactly,
business.
right. But also other creative industries. It has other kind of knock-on effects. So thinking about where different countries are and where they're drawing the line in this balance, and as you mentioned, Medlir earlier, in the case of the U.S., right, there's a tendency to pull back from things that would be seen, or regulatory measures that would be seen as potentially getting in the way of big tech innovations.
Yeah, big tech or even national efforts to develop or to use certain technologies that are enabled. And much of this conversation, by the way, it's interesting because, and this kind of plays with some of the discussions we've already had, but much of this is about the diffusion of technology in a way into the world. The discussions that we're having right now, it's about United States, China, you mentioned Japan, but a lot of this has already moved right into the global south and other regions around the world. And what's going to be interesting going forward is, again, as you point out, to what degree will the United States be comfortable with this kind of, we want the global south to develop. We want it to grow because there's more stability, generally speaking. But on the other hand, this diffusion of technology in the global south means that it may actually compromise our security. So one example of this, for example, is the China-UAE agreement, right? So I think this was in June of this year, the China and the United Arab Emirates came together and they agreed on a high-tech cooperation, among other things. This was like an overarching, there was a big agreement. It wasn't just about technology, but it was across even like defense cooperation. And they both agreed to exchange experiences, according to at least Reuters, on defense and security. And again, quote, with a view to upgrading capacities of military personnel and security institutions in both countries. Okay. Now keep that in mind. At about the same time, the United States is cooperating with UAE companies. I think it's called G42, I think one of them, which is an artificial intelligence firm. And they both announced plans to spend $1 billion on projects in Kenya. So this is Microsoft, a US-based multinational corporation, but very close relations with the United States and US defense establishment, and G42, a UAE-based artificial intelligence company. And they're investing in the global south. They're investing in Kenya, and including their geothermal power data center, which, by the way, raised a bunch of other questions. I think there was a recent article recently, I think just about Mexico, where, farmers don't have enough water for their crops, but you got data centers, right? They're sucking up all this water energy. That's for another day, another conversation on this issue of environment, climate, and water needs for data centers. But so there's this huge investment that a U.S. company and a UAE company have agreed on. But of course, Washington is concerned that this collaboration between Microsoft and G42 could actually imperil national security, right? There are no U.S. officials on board to monitor, to supervise, to make sure this is actually done above board. And of course, there are concerns with regards to NVIDIA's chips, the ultimate kind of the state-of-the-art type of chips, which of course they have become now the new form of arms race. But this conversation, though, Chris, does bring us, again, going back to this interaction between development of technology in the global north and then the diffusion of technology in the global south. And I think this is a challenge. This is an issue that I think countries like the United States and others will have to think long about. Because again, you want on one hand to spread and to increase development across the world. But on the other hand, you have these serious national security concerns, rightly or wrongly, but you do have, you have those concerns. And so all of this, of course, is coming to a head in a couple of weeks at the UN Summit of the Future.
For listeners who might not be so familiar with UN summitry, the United Nations Summit for the Future, it comes out of a broader initiative that was launched by the current UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in the form of his Common Agenda initiative that was presented back in September 2021. Now, the UN Summit for the Future will be taking place in September 2024. Medlir will be there with other representatives of the Global Governance Institute. He'll say more about that in a couple seconds. But broadly speaking, within this common agenda, there's a vision outlined by the UN Secretary General for a future that's based on international cooperation and addresses topics like digital technologies, human rights, global governance, peace and development, all topics that we cover here within the context of this podcast, but also are researched by researchers who are affiliated with the Global Governance Institute in Brussels. Now, of course, this summit is a high-level event that aims to forge a new international consensus on how we deliver and better present and deliver and a better present, but also better safeguard the future, to use the language of the summit organizers. And Medlir, I mentioned you will be there. Can you tell us a little bit more about what we should expect?
Yes. So this is, as you pointed out, a well-publicized and much anticipated UN summit. And you and I have been to similar types of gatherings, whether UN level or somewhere else. But usually what happens is that prior to the summit, you have a couple of days where civil society actors, academics, and others play a bigger role. In this case, the summit itself will take place between September 22nd and 23rd. But on the 20th and the 21st September, there'll be 2 full days with civil society and other, in conjunction, by the way, in cooperation with both state delegations as well as UN agencies. That was the condition for creating these events. They're called side events. And these are called the Future Action Days. And they're, again, organized under the Secretary General's kind of like authority. And the focus here is on the main documents that will come out, or are expected to at least come out of the summit. One of them is the Pact for the Future. The other one is the Global Digital Compact. And another one is a Declaration on Future Generations. And because of that, there is an emphasis on participation of youth. So actually on Friday, all of the participants there'll be mostly youth speakers. And on the 21st, you'll see different actors. And Global Governance Institute, as you said, with which the podcast is affiliated and associated with, and we work there as researchers, is also participating across all 4 days. So we'll be there both Friday and Saturday. And then on Sunday and Monday, both Silvio and Joe Coops will be there participating and perhaps also releasing statements on behalf of Global Governance Institute. So this should be a very eventful. It was funny because a personal anecdote, following my New York visit, I'm headed to Washington, D.C. and visiting with friends and colleagues and also conducting some interviews with regards to AI. And I'm finding that most of them are not in D.C. Most of them will actually be in New York. And so we're setting up visits in New York first, and then we're headed. So anybody who's involved in this field, especially with global governance, and then on top of that, with regards to digital, the technologies, and as well as artificial intelligence will be in New York attending or participating or creating and organizing side events around this summit. So this is a summitry, Chris, as you pointed out. It's all of the embellishments that these kinds of events have. But when I come back, we'll have another episode where I can report a little bit more on the content of that and what took place there. But it's important, I think, maybe what is the reason behind this, right? And the reason behind this is multifold. So one of them is a recognition And I think we can all understand, and some of this is pushed, again, going back to the global south, an unhappiness, both implicit and explicit unhappiness with the existing power sharing that exists in the international institutional framework, right? Governance framework. There are a lot of countries, starting with the UN Security Council, right, that feel that the existing post-World War II international institutional framework is not up to the task. And so there's a lot of talk about reforming international institutions or creating new kind of compacts and agreements around those existing ones, right? The other one is a recognition that partly because of the failure of this institutional framework, there's a recognition that the UN SDGs are not actually being fulfilled. So you have the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 15, 16 of them. It escapes me right now. Then there are lofty goals that are very important goals, like end hunger, right? Or ensure that there's certain diseases, healthcare and others. And we seem to have fallen behind. We have not achieved those. And for veterans of the UN, you'll know that before the SDGs, you have the Millennium Development Goals, and we didn't accomplish those either. And so the question is why, and do we need new structures around that to accomplish them? And the third thing I would say that the reason why we're doing this now is a recognition that technologies and emerging technologies generally, and AI in particular, are presenting certain opportunities as well as challenges and risks that must be addressed right away. And so those are the three things that motivate the UN Summit of the Future. And that's what I'm looking forward to see how those challenges are addressed, what kind of conversations will come out of that. And again, this Pact to the Future, whether countries will ratify it, because the negotiations are still ongoing, and whether they'll ratify it at the end, they'll be signatories to it or not. But it's an important space, especially for, again, when it comes to AI for global development and sustainable development, because this will be the main driver, I think, for the next decade when it comes to international institutions.
Interestingly, we touched on aspects of those three key points in this episode, and we're also going to revisit them in forthcoming episodes later this season. And one thing that you mentioned there, teased a little bit, is this question of AI and development. And I understand, Medlir, there's more work that we are working on behind the scenes also on that. And there's something in particular, I believe, that you've been working on that you would like to share.
That's true. And maybe that's the reason why there's been so much emphasis here on sustainable development and AI. It's
fresh in your mind.
I've been working on this all summer. My plans for the summer were to write 5 books and 10 articles and also put together a little workshop. But of course, the only thing I was able to do is just a workshop. And we know that, right? Academic plans and life interrupts everything else. And of course, I wasn't going to do 5 books, but at least start on a concept. But what I've been working on all summer is actually a 5-day workshop that we are going to hold in Brussels at the end of October. It's actually October 23rd to the 27th, if I'm not mistaken, on AI and global sustainable development. And the objective of that is, in a way, to address a lot of these questions and concerns that we've been talking about. And so we're bringing in a bunch of professionals, international scholars, government officials, EU officials, research from all over the place, all over the world, actually. And we're putting together this 5-day program. And the idea is to help and begin these conversations for individuals and people that work in organizations. Usually participants are sometimes graduate students, but a lot of them are starting mid-career professionals that work for respective governments or that work in the private sector. And they want to actually have increased their skills on knowledge, skills, and practical insights on how do you deal, right, and take advantage of opportunities for the integration of AI in global development. And so initially we set up this overall framing of the debate on what is AI for global development. And then on day 2, 3, and 4, we look at specific sustainable development goals and how AI can help or complicate those conversations. We look at best practices across the world, like whether it's sub-Saharan Africa or Western Balkans or in Asia. And then we will go through those exercises. So we think this is a very important one. We'll put a link up in the episode.
Absolutely. It's not just we think, like the last gathering in May, it was clear from participants. And I might add also, you mentioned there's a wide variety of participants. Often participants in this have just as much or if not more expertise often that they bring to the table from their own professional experience and careers than kind of others who are engaged.
That's right.
In
the program. We haven't actually covered. We did have a similar program taking place in Brussels at the end of May. We haven't covered it here, I think, for our podcast listeners, but it was on AI and global governance. And you're absolutely right. Our participants,
right,
in their specific area, they have and that's why we bring in people that can add a little bit to that. But you're absolutely right that they bring in a wealth of knowledge and experience in their particular expertise.
And I was going to say, one of the things that came out of that, or one of the kind of the conclusions or findings, is that we need a lot more discussions on this topic that this October workshop is going to be focusing on.
That's absolutely right.
And that's it for today's show. Join us again next time for another discussion at the intersection of law, society, and politics. Until then, stay human.